Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Yannicka Ratcliffe, Vice President for Housing Finance Policy and Interim Vice President for the Housing and Communities Policy Center here at the Urban Institute. I'd like to welcome everyone to this important event where we're going to discuss a program that serves a fundamental, critical need but is facing serious challenges. Our session today, Lessons from 40 Years of Public Housing, Where Do We Go From Here?, is a collaboration between the Urban Institute and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. I want to thank the Center on Budget and Peggy Bailey and her colleagues for their partnership and sponsorship over the last 5 years and their dedication to this research for many more. As you'll see today from our terrific lineup, this has been a strong partnership. First, we're going to hear from expert Dr. Susan Popkin, who is the Institute Fellow in the Urban Institute's Housing and Communities Policy Center, and also co-director of Urban's Disability Equity Policy Initiative. She will review how our public housing program has gotten to where it is today and the lessons we can learn from past attempts to address the problems. We'll then have two terrific panels. Peggy Bailey, who is Executive Vice President for Policy and Program Development from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, will lead a panel with HUD officials on their role in overseeing public housing and redevelopment and how the federal government is responding. Next, Sue will facilitate a discussion with 3 public housing authority directors, all of whom are trying to find innovative approaches to preserve this essential housing while facing funding constraints. And then finally, Peggy and her colleague, Will Fisher, who is Senior Director of Housing Policy at the Center on Budget, will bring reflections on the public housing policy landscape going forward. So with that, I'll just walk you through some housekeeping items for today's events. First, this event is being recorded and it will be posted afterwards, so you can review it and share it with your colleagues and networks. Also, you can hide captions or adjust your settings with the live transcript button. All biographies will be available and all slides are available online at urban.org. So if you want to know more or you want to review the slides, please visit the website. All participants will be muted throughout the webinar. But if you have questions and comments, we really welcome those. They help make a richer conversation. Please type them into the Q&A box at any time. We'll also have a survey going out after this event, and we ask that you respond and continue to help us improve our events. And finally, you can engage with us online using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. So with that behind me, I'd like to pass things over to Sue. Dr. Susan J. Popkin is a nationally recognized expert on public and assisted housing programs and policy, and leads Urban's Future of Public Housing initiative. She's led research on public housing, services, and resident outcomes for more than 35 years, has authored several books sharing her research on public housing, and continues to explore new strategies for improving outcomes for families in public and assisted housing with resident-centered and community-engaged approaches. Sue will now share her keynote reviewing 40 years of public housing policy. Thank you, Sue.
Thank you, Yannicka. That's 35 years is a daunting number. And I am really thrilled that so many people have turned out today to talk about the program that is often neglected and often, I would say, viewed with skepticism, viewed negatively. And but still serves more than 1.5 million families with very low incomes. The public housing system is in crisis, and that's happening in the context of the fact that the U.S. is facing a critical shortage of affordable housing overall that is affecting people all across the income spectrum. And at the same time, we have a very small supply, very limited supply of housing to serve the lowest people with the lowest incomes, so deeply subsidized housing. And the estimate is only 1 in 4 people who are eligible for this assistance are actually receiving it. And so it seems at this juncture, this is an opportune moment to think about how we ensure preservation of the existing stock and make sure that we save this important resource for the people who need it. One of the problems that we're facing is the federal government has failed to provide consistent funding for capital needs for public housing over this entire period, over the 40 years. And that means that housing authorities have often not had enough money to maintain their buildings, to make sure that residents have decent, safe, and housing that is sustainable. And I think one thing you can think about as an example right now, one of the problems with the public housing is it's old. Most of it was built before 1974, and it's aging and it's in poor condition. And much of it doesn't have air conditioning. And that's something I'm thinking about this week as we're all going through this terrible heat dome in the Northeast and in the Atlantic. At this point, the total capital backlog estimate, the estimate of what it would take to bring existing public housing up to modern standards, is estimated to be more than $70 billion. That money has not been forthcoming from Congress. It was in the Build Back Better bill that ended up being part of the Inflation Reduction Act, but that housing funding was removed at the time. So I think this is a moment where we should think about where are we and where are we going to go from here? I'm going to step back a minute and tell you some more about the public housing program. It began in it's the nation's oldest housing program. It began in the 1930s as a New Deal initiative. It was initially intended to support the housing industry. That is one of the complications of the way the public housing system works. Public housing is generally administered by local housing authorities who may or may not be part of the municipal city government and report directly to HUD. There have been, over the past 40 years, particularly before 1980, a series of policy decisions that set up public housing for failure. And anyone who has followed my career knows that most of my work was done in Chicago. So most of the examples that I'm going to use today are going to be about Chicago, but I think that's appropriate because most of the policy responses that happened in the 1990s were designed to deal with the problems in Chicago. It didn't necessarily apply to the rest of the stock. But one of the things that is very clear is many of the buildings were poorly designed. In Chicago, which I know best, the very large high rises that many people still remember, they've been gone now for almost 20 years, but they still loom in people's imagination as the image of public housing, had hallways on the outside of the buildings. They had elevator housings on the top of the buildings in Chicago where it gets very cold in the winter. The individual apartments didn't have showers. They didn't have closet doors. They didn't have covers on the light bulbs. There were boilers underground that connected multiple buildings. So if something went wrong, multiple buildings could be left without heat for days. And, the same things occurred in other housing authorities across the country, but Chicago was the best known, most extreme. As I said, there was inadequate funding and oversight. The public housing system wasn't designed with a constant funding stream from the federal government. Housing authorities initially were supposed to be capturing their expenses through rent from tenants who were supposed to be very low income. So one of the effects of that situation is that drove out people who could afford housing elsewhere, didn't want to deal with that. There was for a long time inadequate oversight from the federal government, from HUD. In too many cities, there was poor management, there was corruption. In Chicago, famously, the chair of the Chicago Housing Authority Board during the 1980s stole the money that was intended for repairs and invested it in Marina City, which is a luxury high-rise development along the river. And then this was done intentionally. There was these buildings were sited in poor communities that were disinvested and then were cut off in many cases from the rest of the city by highways. Buildings were built next to environmental hazards like lead smelters or toxic waste dumps. Chicago and Washington, D.C., the highway systems were built right along the public housing and cut them off. So all of those problems contributed to the problems with the housing, to the lack of investment, and to the isolation of the residents. 1980s, the system was recognized as being in crisis. A big focus was on crime and public housing. The first big congressional intervention was the Public Housing Drug Elimination Act, which gave public housing authorities grants they could apply for funding for things like anti-drug programs, because this was the Reagan era, right? For public housing authority security and public housing authority police. That was followed in the early 90s by the Congress commissioned the National Commission for Severely Distressed in Public Housing. I said that a lot of this was conditioned on what was happening in Chicago. One of the chairs of the committee was the then head of the Chicago Housing Authority. They came up with a series of recommendations for a major investment in what they called the severely distressed public housing. That was, and for social services to be provided to residents, for an office to be created at HUD that would focus only on severely distressed public housing. Most of those recommendations were never implemented in full. There were also policies during the 90s to address the funding and management problems. The comprehensive grant program was intended to address the problems with inconsistent funding and give housing authorities funding by formula instead of by grants. The public housing management program was intended to make sure there was better oversight of agencies. A number of agencies were designated as troubled through that system, and some of them were put into HUD receivership or judicial receivership. Chicago was the highest profile case of that. HUD sent the second in command, Joe Schuldner, to Chicago to take over the agency with a team from HUD to show as an example that they could turn around the most troubled housing authority in the country. But there were a number of other housing authorities that went into receivership also at the same period: New Orleans, DC, San Francisco, Seattle, and others. And then finally, something that lives on as a legacy of this period is the one strike policy for crimes committed in public housing, which is a policy that allows housing authorities to evict tenants or deny housing to people who are convicted of various crimes, specifically cooking meth in their unit and violent sexual offenses, but also gives them great leeway to apply these rules as they see fit. And this had it, because of the disparate effects on people of color, this had disparate effects on people of color who live in public housing. The policy was upheld by the Supreme Court, I think, in 2001. So it's still in place today. There was also in this period a push for deregulation. This was the era of welfare reform. So the biggest deregulation effort is called the Moving to Work demonstration. It actually gives housing authorities the ability to apply for waivers, and the ones who are in the demonstration to shift some of their funding so they can use funding intended for one purpose to use for public housing, for management, for redevelopment. And maybe some of our housing authority official guests today will talk more about what the details of that are today. There was also QARA, the Quality Housing and Work Responsibility Act, which brought flexibility for redevelopment. The biggest change it made was it allowed housing authorities to tear down their public housing. It repealed what was called the 1-for-1 replacement rule, which had said before that they had to replace every unit of public housing, whether it was occupied or not. There also was in 1999, that act was amended with the Faircloth Amendment, which capped the number of public housing units to the total that existed in 1999. All of that together has cost a loss of units of about 100,000 public housing units overall. One of the ways that the recommendations of the National Commission were implemented was the Hope 6 program, which ran from 1993 to 2024 is incorrect, through 2012. It was the largest federal effort to address the distressed public housing and provided very large grants to housing authorities to redevelop their worst properties. It caused a shift to mixed income replacement housing. You can see there's a picture, a very old picture of Oakwood Shores in Chicago, which replaced one of their public housing developments. And as I said, that in total with the other regulations caused a loss of approximately 100,000 deeply subsidized units. Hope 6 was replaced with the Choice Neighborhoods program. We know from Hope 6 that most of the tenants did not return to the original developments, but through studies that we did at Urban Institute, we know that most ended up in better housing and safer neighborhoods, mostly with vouchers. And that there was an effect on conditions in the neighborhoods, that crime was lowered in the neighborhoods after the public housing was torn down. We don't yet have the evaluation of the Choice Neighborhoods program has not yet been published, but there should be results coming from that later this year. Finally, there are now currently what we call conversion strategies. I said that the Congress has not adequately funded the public housing program for the past 40 years, but they have funded the Section 8 voucher program. And then since the Obama administration, there has been the ability to convert public housing units to the project-based section vouchers or rental assistance that under the RAD program that allows housing authorities to leverage their funds for redevelopment. There are challenges with that program as well. The subsidies are often too low to meet, to meet the capital needs for all those repairs that I talked about. RAD does provide protections to tenants. It allows them the right to return, and it can be combined with the Section 18 tenant protection vouchers, which give housing authorities a little more funding for redevelopment and to sustain the buildings. Where we are right now is the system is facing in a very uncertain future. And you're going to hear today from colleagues at HUD and leaders from housing authorities about some of the approaches housing authorities are using to revitalize and preserve their public housing stock. But the truth is that huge capital needs and funding gaps remain. There needs to be substantial federal investment to prevent the closure of public housing properties. Local and state governments may also need to provide greater support for public housing than they have in the past. If all that doesn't happen, we're going to lose the buildings. And that has already happened in places around the country. One example is Cairo, Illinois, where the buildings were in such poor condition that HUD required the housing authority to close them. The tenants all were given vouchers. There was nowhere for them to rent housing in the community, and they had to move as much as an hour away from their own community. That's a future we could be looking at for a lot of people, and probably people who would have difficulty navigating the private market, even with a voucher. So I'm hoping we're going to have a discussion today about some of these challenges and how we can preserve the existing stock. And now I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Peggy Bailey, who's going to lead a discussion with two of our HUD officials about where HUD's public housing program stands at this moment. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sue, and hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be here today with two of my former HUD colleagues from my time at HUD. We're on for this first panel. We'll be joined by Marianne Nazaro, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Office of Public Housing Investments, and Tom Davis, who is the Director of the Office of Recapitalization at HUD. Hello, Tom and Marianne.
Great to be here.
So I'm really excited about having Tom and Marianne with us today, because one of the things that I learned in my time at HUD is how hard folks are working with limited resources and facing many of the challenges that Sue just lined out for us. And there's a need to shine a spotlight on that work, because leaning into the creative ways that HUD is trying to help improve public housing and centering the lives of the people that are in public housing is critical as we think about how to move forward. Former Secretary Marcia Fudge and current interim secretary Adrian Todman are both committed to helping people who live in public housing, and making sure that we're not forgetting that it's not just that we're remembering that's not just about the building, but it's about the people who live in these buildings. And so with that, I will get started and with my first question, so that Tom and Marianne can help explain a little bit about their roles at HUD. So I'll start with Tom. Can you give the audience an introduction of yourself and explain broadly the role that your office has and the roles that your offices play in public housing and public housing redevelopment?
Sure, and thank you so much for having us here. So the Office of Recapitalization is really focused on the implementation, with respect to public housing, is focused on the implementation of the rental assistance demonstration, which we refer to as RAD. It is a mechanism to allow housing authorities to convert formerly public housing units to the Section 8 project-based rental assistance platform, whether that's capital PBRA, which is one form of Section 8, or project-based vouchers, which is a different form of Section 8. But the origin of RAD was an effort to think about how public housing could be modified so that housing authorities can be more entrepreneurial, and how they could tap into a variety of other affordable housing resources. And I wasn't at HUD at the time, but my understanding is that they came to the conclusion that rather than try to adjust all of the regulatory frameworks and parameters that Sue was outlining, that it was a simpler process to move the housing from public housing to Section 8, where the residents still get 30%, still pay 30% of their income as rent. They are still, from the resident perspective, functioning like the public housing portfolio. So RAD was created about 10 years ago. In the past 10 years, we have seen housing authorities and their teams be very entrepreneurial, be able to leverage about $17 for every $1 of appropriated funds. They have secured over $19.5 billion worth of investment in their units, just shy of 200,000 units. And we've also seen housing authorities do really creative things with moving the assistance to better locations when the original public housing site was built in housing inappropriate places and subject to a lot of that bad siting that Sue had mentioned. So RAD is an exciting tool. It's a voluntary tool, and it does not replace public housing for the housing authorities where it works. It's just an option for housing authorities to consider when they're thinking about how to grapple with these capital needs and modernization needs.
Thanks, Tom. Mary Ann?
Hi, thank you so much, Peggy. Always good to see you. And thanks for having us here. This is a really critical conversation, and I appreciate the way, Sue, that you teed it up. Just a quick little about me. I'm a proud Pennsylvania native. I've been with the department for over 20 years. In that time, I've worked in the homelessness office. I've worked in disasters, on the moving to work program, and choice. And I've got my master's in social work. So and so that's kind of just a little bit about who I am. I'm currently the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Public Housing Investments. So at OPHI, we like to say that we invest in the people, which are at the center of everything that we do. Those services programs that Sue alluded to, a lot of those are coming out of my office. The housing, both the public housing capital program as well as the mixed finance programs to both develop new public housing as well as reinvest in other public housing, kind of leveraging additional resources. The Special Application Center, which when it is appropriate for those agencies to have public housing leave the portfolio, they work through the Special Application Center to transition out of public housing, as well as the Main Street program, which is serves those very small communities. We invest in neighborhoods. You heard Sue talk a little bit about the Choice Neighborhoods program. We've really learned a lot from the Hope 6 programs that we're incorporating into Choice Neighborhoods, where we are redeveloping in not just housing, definitely the people, but also in the broad neighborhood investments. And we innovate. So the MTW Moving to Work demonstration that Sue alluded to is really designed to give the agencies the flexibility to try something new, to see if they can kind of use the dollars in the way that best makes sense in their communities. And I think all of us agree we need to find a way to ensure easy access to safe, affordable housing in strong communities, ensuring that people have the supports that they need.
Thanks, Mary Ann. So I'm going to start with you for the next question. Can you talk a little bit about how the HUD offices, how your office and Tom's office work together to oversee public housing and the redevelopment piece as you navigate with limited resources?
Yeah, absolutely. And our teams are working together every single day. And Tom and I, every single Wednesday at 2:00, we are on the phone working together to process those transactions. As Sue said, that there's currently $1.5 million people living in public housing. About 44% of those are elderly or disabled. About half of them are children. And so we really do want to make sure that those people that are living in public housing have, again, the safe, decent, affordable housing that they need. In many places, public housing works great, right? It's cost effective. It's got strong resident protections. In many communities, it's often the only game in town for affordable housing. So it really does work well in some places. But as Sue teed it up, it's we've got some challenges, and definitely the funding is a big piece of it. There is currently, depending on which estimate you're looking at and how you do it, somewhere between 65 to over $100 billion in capital backlog. We are simply not getting enough federally appropriated funds for capital purposes that we need. This administration has demonstrated their commitment through both the Build Back Better as well as the $7.5 billion investment that they've asked for on the mandatory side in the last 2 budget years. But we haven't gotten either of those. And either way, it's just not enough, right? We can't just rely on the federal investment to address what we need to do. So for those PHAs where it makes sense to stay in, there's financing tools to rehab or to develop new public housing. And in a lot of places, it makes the most sense for them to reposition from public housing to that Section 8 platform. And that's where that intersection is really where our teams work really well together to give the PHAs and the residents the options that are there, let them choose, and then some of the tools to reposition. And then I'm going to are the RAD tool, Faircloth to RAD, the Section 18 RAD blends, things like that. But our teams really work together to make sure that PHAs are aware of all of the options that are on the table. Tom?
Yeah, I agree that our teams work very closely together, and it's great to have thoughtful partners across the department. You know, there are many housing authorities where the capital fund that they are getting is enough to provide quality housing. And so for them, there may not be any reason to change. Some of them choose to for regulatory reasons and processing reasons, but the real emphasis on RAD and some of these other tools is when the capital fund is inadequate to the needs of the community. And converting to Section 8 opens the door to tapping into other methods of financing. It makes it possible to take out a mortgage and borrow commercial debt. It makes it easier to tap into tax credits. Now, of course, the tax credits in many places are a finite resource that is oversubscribed. That may change if the tax law is adjusted, as is currently being talked about on the Hill. But so some of these are resources that have others tapping into them and are not endless resources. But certainly the ability to think about a broader pool of sources of funding, from things that are currently unavailable to public housing to things that are doable but clunky in public housing. No offense to our public housing friends who are doing great work with what the regulations and statute require. So I think that a lot of the collaboration that we've gotten between our offices is coming up with new ideas. So, for example, a few years ago, we saw some housing authorities that were tapping into Section 18, what's called Section 18 Disposition Authority, which is a mechanism to take properties out of public housing and put them into Section 8 with tenant protection vouchers, and then project basing those vouchers and going forward, as Section 8, but that's a very high bar to clear to get permission to do that. And so we work together on ways where if they're participating in RED and using some of the Section 18, we can make it an easier process for them to get that approval, so that they're pulling from both and getting the best of both worlds in terms of some of the higher revenue stream and all of the resident protections and all of the focus and oversight on the construction improvements and making sure the property is modernized and brought up to shape. So I think all of this is an effort to grapple with the fact that the capital fund varies year to year, but is in the universe of what is it, Marianne, $3 billion ish each year.
Yep.
And
Yep.
if you look at what local actors have chosen to invest in their properties in the last few years through RED and extrapolated that to the remaining portfolio, we would need $115 billion worth of funding. And the closest we've come to that in my memory is Build Back Better, which was not successful in the end. But it's a scale of dollars that is just can't be addressed at $3 billion a year increments.
Right, and just one other point along those lines, right, is that in the conversion, because it switches to Section 8, what is paying for the rent subsidy also increases over time in a way that the capital grant doesn't.
Correct.
To try to keep up with.
The capital grant is subject to annual appropriation that goes up and down. The Section 8 contract is a long-term contract with the federal government and has an inflation adjustment factor to it, so that it is setting a number and going up from there. Whereas in the public housing context, we've seen years when the number went down, years when the number went up, but it's less predictable.
And to your point, yeah, and to your point, Peggy, there's no inflation adjuster even in the capital fund formula. And so that's a challenge.
So, Marianne, from your perspective, how have these innovative policy changes that HUD's been able to make helped helped your work or to improve public housing, or other things that you want to point out where HUD has leaned into the authority that HUD has to make changes that don't involve extra resources from Congress?
Yeah, so we definitely are working to kind of streamline and simplify the tools, right? Making it easier. I think I wrote down doable but clunky, Tom. I might be quoting you on that term. Like there's some doable but clunky requirements in public housing. And so we're working through those, or there's things that we could do to streamline those to make it less clunky. We've proposed for several years, it hasn't been picked up yet, but to be able to use the public housing operating and capital funding more flexibly. And so specifically in the 24-25 budget, we proposed that any PHA that, if they've got a low physical assessment score, they would be able to use their operating funds, their operating reserves to address their capital needs. And so we think this would be a really great way to unlock some of those resources. There's a lot of climate resources out there. So while Build Back Better didn't get incorporated into the bipartisan infrastructure law or the Inflation Reduction Act, there's well over $1 trillion that our federal family did receive through that. And there's resources there that our agencies can connect to. So we are working really closely within the federal family to figure out how to make it possible for our agencies, our PHAs, public housing, to be able to tap into those resources that some of those other federal agencies got, so that we can use that. And we're always looking for ways to simplify and streamline. I'm really excited to announce today, late breaking as of today, one of those challenges has been around the historic preservation space. And there's been some, really there's that balance between ensuring that that we are preserving the historicalness of properties, while at the same time ensuring that we have enough affordable housing. So we have been working really close with the Council of Historic Preservation, and we are going to be working with them to reduce the requirements, the historic preservation requirements on minor interior modifications. Across the board for the federal family, but also specifically in public housing. So we're really excited on that partnership with the chair of the historic preservation, and our first listening session on that is tomorrow. So we're always looking for different ways that we can streamline, simplify, access additional resources to make it work.
Marianne, just a follow-up question, because
Yeah.
we got a question in the chat about the Inflation Reduction Act and the other bills that passed in the last couple of years. You mentioned, working with partners at Treasury and other agencies. Is there anything more, or an example to give along those lines?
Yeah, so we are hoping to be, and I'll be able to, we've got like a communication that we can send out now. What we're trying to do at this point is working with the other federal agencies to figure out exactly who is eligible for the different types of funding that they have, to ensure that our agencies, public housing are eligible recipients of those funding. And then once kind of we have that, then we want to make sure that we're tying it all together. So we are in the kind of working with our federal family to kind of figure it out at this point, and then we will get that out there. We do have a website called the Build for the Future website, where there's a lot, it talks about all the different resources that are available. So if you go to our HUD exchange, or really just type in Google Build for the Future, you would be able to find out all of the different resources that are available and how you might be able to access them in your local community.
Great, thanks, Marianne.
Just to add on to that, the IRA, and in particular, has a lot of resources that are available to public housing, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, the rebates, the tax credits. Those are resources that are broadly available, and the work that Marianne and her team are doing to make that transparent is incredibly important. But and just a reminder to folks that to keep watching that space, because as a foundational principle, most of those resources are work in traditional public housing, as well as in properties that are converted to Section 8.
Exactly.
Tom, this question is, I'm going to start with you. And, we know that for HUD, it is important to center the lives of the folks that are living in public housing, and the fact that they deserve better housing. And that oftentimes in the implementation of the things that HUD does, folks can feel like that can be lost. And that we know that, a lot more can be done around help making sure that residents are informed of what processes are happening, and how they can move things forward. One of the things that sticks with me from my time at HUD is how the Secretary Fudge really worked to help explain that. A lot of, that, look, there's HUD, the reason that so much has to be done, and people's lives are disrupted during redevelopment efforts, is because of the lack of investment that the federal government has made in the past, and that HUD has apologized for that. So, and part of that and so, with all of that in mind, can you talk about how your office's approach to resident engagement and helping residents understand and helping PHAs live up to their obligation to make sure that residents are treated fairly and educate and understand the process the housing authority is going through. How your office is evolved in carrying that forward and helping housing authorities do a better job.
Absolutely. And the resident engagement and resident rights is a core foundational principle of the RAD program. Some of the statutory language was written in direct response to some of the failures of things like the Hope 6 program. There's a requirement of replacing units. There's a right of return for the residents. There are a number of other provisions around resident engagement and resident protections that have been built into the program right from the start. But we've also learned a lot of things along the way and have continued to enhance and strengthen the resident protections. So, for example, several years ago, we introduced the concept of a front-end affirmative review of certain steps that might have fair housing concerns, and we added additional relocation protections beyond the Federal Uniform Relocation Act protections. And we have, just as recently as this past summer, we did a comprehensive revisiting of the procedures around resident engagement to make sure that there are requirements around meetings at various stages in the process with the residents, and reporting to us of how those meetings were done and what the content was, so that we have better insight and visibility into whether the housing authorities are living up to the spirit as well as the letter of the requirements. And have just a few years ago, we established a team that is dedicated to resident engagement and protections, that is doing a lot of site visits and trainings and development of materials. This is an area where one can always do better, but there is a lot of information to help the residents understand their rights on the HUD.gov website. We have established a resident complaints line where residents can report on things that they see that are concerning, and the team circles back with the residents and tries to figure it out, often doing mediation with the housing authority or putting forward corrective steps that the housing authority needs to take. So there is a lot of structure around that. In that context, it's important to remember that significant construction is disruptive. Whether you're planning it yourself in your own home or whether your landlord is planning it in your home, it is disruptive. And the affordable housing financial structure means that it happens in significant events. Like in the private market, there's often much more in the way of a gut rehab between tenants and that kind of thing. Whereas in the affordable housing space, your big investments happen every 15 years when there is a low-income housing tax credit transaction or something like that. And the residents are living there, and the residents, unfortunately, have to put up with that level of disruption. So it's really important, both in terms of the rules and in terms of best practices for housing authorities, to be thinking about how this disruption can be mitigated. And so we spend a lot of time and effort trying to communicate to residents what their rights are, and communicate to housing authorities what their obligations are, and also what are the best practices for doing that. And I think that the RAD program has been recognized as having a pretty robust set of requirements, and also a very robust set of resources for both residents and housing authorities on how to really embrace the spirit of this. But it's certainly something that we continue to focus on. It's changed a lot over the 10 years of RAD's existence, and we are still learning and introducing new perspectives into this conversation.
And Mary Ann, can you talk about the work that your team is doing on resident perspective, especially when, you know, it's not a RAD, which is the or when it's not involving RAD at all.
Of course, yeah, and I gotta say, I'm really excited by all the work that Tom's team is doing around resident engagement and the resident engagement team. That's really, I think, really helpful. We've learned a lot since the Hope 6 days, and so the Choice Neighborhood program, which is kind of which kind of grew out of Hope 6, learned a lot from that, and especially around the need to engage early and often and constantly anytime that there's resident, that the residents' lives are going to be impacted. And so starting early, we've got a team that works closely with the grantees as they're going through this, kind of meeting with the residents, making sure that they're involved, in what the newly developed housing and community is going to look like. And so that is one place. I'm really excited at the work that my colleague Danielle Bastarash and her team are doing to engage with public housing residents. So specifically, she's in Boston this week. They're going and having sessions across the country where they are kind of listening to people who live in public housing, the resident associations, hearing their experiences. They are making sure that they understand all of the rules, all of the policies. So they're making sure to teach them like what the rules are, especially those resident association, resident leaders. They're engaging with them on how to be an effective resident association so that they can kind of build that out. And they're also using the feedback that they are hearing during those sessions to inform the policies that we are making here in DC, which I think is so critical. They've already been to Birmingham and Chicago. They're in Boston this week. They're going to Denver and DC later this year, and then they're going to be going in other parts of the country later on next year. So it's just really been diving into engaging with public housing residents. In my office, as I mentioned earlier, we have the 3 funded services programs, the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, the Resident Opportunities for Self-Sufficiency programs, the Jobs Plus programs. Most of those programs don't just serve public housing residents, but they also serve residents that are on the Section 8 platforms, whether it's PBV, PBRA. In some instances, they serve tribes or resident associations. We've got the Connect Home program to help connect, build the partnerships in the communities around broadband. And that one, we opened it up to the continuums of care and the homelessness providers, which we're really excited about. One of the things that Tom and I have talked about a lot, and there's a lot more work that we need to do in this space, but is to ensure that there is a kind of similar resident experience across platforms. And so whether you are in a RAD PBV or a public housing or PBRA, there's different rules that apply to the different places. And so that can be confusing. And so I think that that's, work that could be done, that we could do better. And I know Tom and I are both really interested in that as well.
Mary Ann. All right, well, that was probably the fastest 30 minutes of my entire day. So we are at time for this panel. I want to thank Tom and Mary Ann for taking time out of their day to participate, and I will pass things off to Sue.
Thank you, Peggy, and thank you, Tom and Mary Ann. That was a terrific discussion. And now I'd like to welcome 3 housing authority directors who are going to talk about what they're trying to do to cope with these challenges in their housing authorities. We have, now I can't find my notes. Lisa Bova Hyatt, who is the CEO of the New York City Housing Authority, which is the largest housing authority in the United States. Michael Johnson, who is the executive director of the Cambridge Housing Authority in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And Ivory Matthews, who is the CEO of Horn Forward, which is the housing authority of Portland and Multnomah County. So not Chicago. And I'd like to start kicking this off. I'd like to kick it off with Lisa. And I want to all of you to speak to this, but Lisa, what are your housing authority's current capital needs? And how do you react to the numbers you've been hearing in the other conversations?
Well, first, thank you so much for having us. I love talking about NYCHA and all of the challenges that we have as the largest public housing authority in the country. So our capital needs, we did a physical needs assessment in 2023. And our capital needs are currently $78 billion. And so it was interesting to see on the slides earlier that in 2020, across the country, it was about 70 billion. But for us, with our 2,000 buildings and 350 developments, our capital needs are close to $80 billion. And the challenge really is that our federal capital grant has not even been close enough to keeping up with the pace that we need to fix our buildings. So we get less than $1 billion a year. This year, our federal capital grant was about $20 million less than we had anticipated. So when you think about an aging housing stock, you know, I think the majority of our buildings are over a half a century old. And with the capital needs going up each and every year, we all need to come up with creative ways to address this issue, given the fact that we're not getting the amount of capital dollars that we need across the country.
Thank you. How about you, Michael? How about your housing authority? Much smaller, but.
Yeah, our numbers don't come close to Lisa's numbers. We've actually done about $760 million worth of construction in the last 12 years, about $1 billion of development work, over 3,000 units. 98% of our units have been converted to Section 8, but we still have about $650 million worth of capital needs ahead of us. I think the thing always drives me crazy about these capital numbers is it's really, when we talk straight capital, it's a Band-Aid, right? It's, you know, gee, the boilers need to get fixed, or the windows need to get fixed, or the roof needs to get fixed. And what we have found is our 50-year-old buildings, our 60-year-old buildings, our 70-year-old buildings all need major retrofits. And they need major retrofits because my pledge when I became ED was I have to leave the portfolio in a better position than when I got it. And that means it needs to be sustainable, and it needs to be something that people can live in 50 years. Forget about the 15-year compliance period. It needs to be here in 50 years and in perpetuity. So things like energy savings, you know, we've actually cut our energy costs by $3.5 million a year, and that funds $50 million worth of improvements in our capital work. So again, you know, I have to credit HUD for giving us a lot of tools. You know, I heard Marianne talking earlier, Tom, both great people, and they have really, they and others that they work with at HUD have really kind of turned the tables and given us a lot to work with, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay. And how about you, Ivory? I know the housing isn't as old from the West Coast, so.
No, we're certainly not as old in the West Coast, but you know, I will start by first saying that Home Forward, like many of our housing authorities across the country, have faced decades long of inadequate federal appropriations of public housing operating and capital funds, which certainly have constrained our ability to operate, maintain, repair, and develop, you know, our traditional public housing units. And so we, you know, like most of our colleagues have underwent these huge preservation initiatives. And Home Forward, we began in 2013 with an initiative that we titled 85 Stories. And 85 Stories represented over 5,000 units of our existing portfolio of public housing rent assistance homes. And we worked with HUD and underwent several Section 18 approvals to convert our public housing to the Section 8 platform, primarily the rental assistance demonstration program, which has been a tremendous redevelopment tool for us. And this transition allowed us to leverage equity and debt to make necessary capital improvements. And so we've did a lot of capital upgrades to our portfolio. We've since 2000, so we started the initiative in 2013. Since 2016 was our first go at like putting together those resources into our units. And we've transitioned 95% of our housing portfolio from the public housing platform over to the Section 8 platform. And we used approximately, I would say, a little over $200 million in capital improvements that we've made, mostly to address major systems. And that 200 million came mostly from a combination of, HUD resources. I would say the less of the funds came from HUD resources, but the majority came from accessing local and state resources, which I hope to talk about a little bit later in this conversation.
Definitely going to come back to that.
Yes.
And right, I think I'll stick with you for the next question. Can you talk about some of the key obstacles you faced in all this redevelopment work you've done?
Certainly, by and large, one of the things I will say, the same thing that drives up rents, which is the cost of building housing, stands in the way of building more affordable housing. For example, as a for-profit apartment building is built with loans that assume that you're going to charge, enough rents to cover the expenses and make some profit. But that means market rate units, like, for example, in Portland, the average rent for a 2-bedroom unit ranges from $2,300 to $2,800 a month, depending on the area of town that you live in. And for a studio apartment, it's $1,600 to $2,000 a month. But if we were building, which we do build affordable housing units, we're going to say that our residents, won't pay more than 30% to afford that unit, which is typically a third of their income. So we can't statutorily raise the rents in order to meet the expanding operational costs to maintain the units and also certainly cover any gaps that might be needed to cover during the financing of these developments. So, we have several obstacles that we face. Obstacle one is, we have the obstacle of not being able to raise rent statutorily to cover the cost of our units. And obstacle two is, sometimes we have unintended consequences of local programs that might require us to add in things like place streets in the middle of our properties that we have to pay for those costs, or add additional amenities like bike paths and public amenities. And we certainly want public amenities at our redevelopments, but it's unintended consequences and obstacles that increase costs. And then one of the things I will highlight is the Fair Cloth to RAD program. Unlike the regular RAD program, it has a lot of options similar to choice neighborhood designs, which we found has been an obstacle for us to transition some of those Fair Cloth to RAD units. And so how are we navigating these things for Home Forward? We have recently, we have added additional capacity to our policy department, where we have folks who are targeted towards local, state, and federal advocacy. And those folks are on a constant basis are really placing our agency in a position where we're seen as thought partners and making critical decisions to impact redevelopment initiatives on all of those, local, state, and federal levels. And then we've been able to seek and are seeking access to local funds. And that's how we've been able to maneuver through some of those challenges.
And we go to Lisa next. How about you? What are some of the key obstacles you have faced in New York? Which I think we have 3 of the most expensive housing markets in the country represented here.
Exactly. So I think one of NYCHA's greatest challenges in this area and others is building back resident trust. You know, we talked about Hope 6 in the beginning, and there's been just a general skepticism by our residents of our ability to preserve and rehabilitate properties while also preserving resident rights. They want to make sure that their homes are protected. And so we've been able over the past, 6 or 7 years, slowly overcome that obstacle by outlining our plans and then delivering on our progress. So when you look at our version of the RAD program, which is called PACT, Permanent Affordability Commitment Together, we've now converted 20,000 units. There was a lot of skepticism originally, but now we have tenants telling other tenants, bringing them into their homes, showing them what it looks like. And I think resident engagement has a lot to do with that. We now have our residents sitting with us on panels, choosing the designated developer. And I think, Ivory, you had said something when we spoke the last time about having our residents participate in the process so that we're doing redevelopment with and not for. And we've really shown a lot of progress, both in our version of PACT, but also in the trust, the New York City Housing Preservation Trust, which I can talk about a little later.
Okay, great. And Michael, how about you?
So costs, number one, I see in the chat, one of the questions is, has some of these tools really helped? And, capital, we used to get $5 million a year for capital for 3,000 units. And as I just said, we've done $760 million worth of work. To do that, we've pulled out $530 million of equity, and we've leveraged through debt $230 million. How many years at $5 million a year would it have taken me to do all of that work, right? The number's crazy. I have a list of 22,000 people here in Cambridge. We're very small geographically. We're 7 miles by 2 miles. As Sue mentioned, we are one of, actually, I think the National Low Income Housing Coalition has us as number 3 on their chart for most expensive markets in the country. A 1-bedroom goes for about $35,000 to $4,000 a month here in Cambridge. And the average rent in one of my 1-bedrooms is only $571. That's the average tenant rent. How's the low-income housing tax credit rent is, and I want to make sure I give you the right number right now, is $1,836. So none of my folks, none of the 22,000 people on the waiting list could ever afford to get into one of these quote unquote affordable housing units through the low-income housing tax credits. Now, we do use certainly low-income housing tax credits as a mechanism for redevelopment. As a matter of fact, it's the backbone for our redevelopment. But here in Massachusetts, there is not enough private activity bonds available to meet the demand. The state has about $1 billion worth of projects in the pipeline at any given year. And they only get about $670 million in private activity bonds. So we have to stand in line just like everyone else. But the bottom line is, if we keep going the way we're going and we keep losing these public housing units, we're not going to be able to serve the 22,000 people that are on my list. And I'm sure Lisa's list is just, I don't even want to think about the number. And Ivory's number is probably just the same. And these are the folks that we're leaving behind. So thank you.
I will start with you here. But you've all alluded to innovative strategies you've been using, and also to policies that you need, state and local policies. Can you talk a little bit about the key partners you've engaged along the way with the redevelopments you have been able to put in place?
So we've used a lot of tools. So first of all, we're an MTW agency. So everybody says, oh my God, you have MTW, you can do anything you want. And it's not true. It's not the only thing that makes these redevelopments work. RAD, Section 18, the RAD blend, fair cloth to RAD. MTW is just a sauce that pulls everything together. So we are really advocating nationally and locally, when I say locally through the state, to try to figure out a way to increase the volume cap for low-income housing tax credits. Congresswoman Clark had introduced a number of years ago the SAVE Act, which would have really assisted housing authorities in getting access to private activity bonds. It never made it. Sometimes Congress can't get out of their own way. I didn't say that though. So the tools that we use, we rely a lot on the city of Cambridge. The city recently passed the Affordable Housing Overlay, which basically opens the door to 100% affordable housing development to kind of bypass and build as of right rather than go through the typical zoning process. And that's been great. But again, we still have this problem with the cost of construction. We're a union city, we're a union state. The cost of land here is astronomical. If I could shake the tree today and get all of the private activity bonds I wanted from heaven, I could build today 560 units today, brand new out of the ground units that were never ever public housing or anything else. So that's my wish.
Okay. And how about you, Ivory? I know there have been some interesting partnerships in Oregon.
Yes, I won't repeat any of the federal stuff that Michael just mentioned, because we also access those extremely valuable tools as well. But I'll talk a little bit about what we've relied on here in Portland. And for example, in the state of Oregon, we've had unprecedented legislature directed funding. Most recently, our new Governor Tina Kotek, her first day in office last year, she came out of the gate saying that housing was one of her primary platforms, and she got a group of folk together to establish a housing production advisory council. Out of that council, we produced a number of different recommendations to our legislatures, and this year, most recently, the Senate passed Senate Bill 1537, which allocated $369 million of funding meant to help the state backfill the decades-long housing shortage. And so these funds are going to be made available to produce housing at all income levels. We've also, in 2016, our city of Portland, the voters approved a $258 million affordable housing bond measure to create new affordable housing units using two key approaches. One is to build new high-quality multifamily rental housing developments in neighborhoods with good access to public transit and other key amenities. And the second was to purchase existing buildings and convert them into permanently affordable housing units. There is a goal of creating 1,300 homes to date. We have over 1,800 homes that have been created, and we've tapped into some of those resources here at Home Forward. And then 2 years later, our metro regional government passed a housing bond. Voters approved the housing bond of $652 million. And that bond covered 3 of our counties in which Home Forward operates in. There's a goal of creating over 1,400 units for that bond, and we've created over 1,500 units and counting. And so Home Forward has accessed those resources too. Last 2 things I want to mention is our state has an affordable housing tax credit program, which allows us to access favorable loan terms in that program. So that's a capital stack that we've accessed here at Home Forward. And then in 2016, our state legislature also passed what is called the LIFT program, Local Innovations and Fast Track Program. They created two categories, one for the creation of homeownership units and one for the creation of rental units. And so we've accessed the LIFT funds as well. So we've been extremely fortunate that our legislature has really focused on and put additional resources to help us tap into, to layer those resources on the federal resources that we currently have.
Before I go to Lisa, I just want to acknowledge that we have gotten a lively conversation in the Q&A. And if we don't get to all the questions during this session, we will be sending out a follow-up email afterwards, so we'll try to address them. And Lisa, do you want to talk about New York? Because last time I was at a meeting about NYCHA was 2019, and it was in a crisis. And since then, lots of things have happened.
A lot has happened since 2019, but I think the most exciting is the Public Housing Preservation Trust, which was signed into law by Governor Hochul in 2022. And that really provides two things. One, as a new government agency, it provides additional procurement flexibilities, and it preserves NYCHA management of the properties once the properties transfer from Section 9 to project-based Section 8. But what's most incredible about the trust is that residents get to decide the future of their own developments. And this goes back to with and not for. What we do when we approach development to ask them if they want to undertake a vote, we have 100 days of engagement, providing them with information about the trust, about PACT, which is our version of RAD. And they have three choices: to maintain the status quo, to transfer to the trust, and to transfer to the PACT program. Because one of the things that we saw from residents when we would talk to them about RAD is they were very concerned about, you know, in air quotes, the privatization of public housing. So the trust provides a purely public model. So after the 100 days of engagement, we have a 30-day voting period where people can vote in person, by mail, or online. And so last year we had our first vote, Nostrand Houses in Brooklyn, and they voted to join the trust. That was followed by a senior development at the end of last year at Bronx River Edition. And we currently have two engagement periods underway. Voting will take place in July. And I have to tell you, the tenants are really very excited. We, work collaboratively with advocates, with our state and local partners, and of course, our federal partners. This really takes a village, and we're really listening to what both our residents, advocates, and our elected officials have to say, and it's worked out pretty well.
Before I go to Michael and Ivory to talk about resident engagement, because I want to make sure we talk about that everywhere, can you just talk about how many units are covered by PACT and by the trust, and how many are not? Because I think that puts the context around what the situation.
Absolutely.
Your backlog you started
So just
with.
to be clear, we have 176,000 units. About 20,000 have converted through our PACT program. We have another 17,000 that are currently in various levels of engagement. And pursuant to the state statute that created the trust, the most that can transfer is 25,000 units. So it would basically leave us, our goal is to hit 62,000 units with our PACT program, 25,000 units for the trust, which obviously the ability to go back to the legislature. We're really in the infancy stage of the trust at this point, but it would leave basically the another half of our portfolio to think about other creative solutions. And one of the things that we're doing, which I feel like we could talk about for at least a half an hour, is Fulton Elliott Chelsea, which are developments in one of the loveliest neighborhoods in Manhattan. The buildings are so old, and through our very robust engagement with the residents there, they decided that rather than go through rehabilitation, they want to completely rebuild. And so it's something that I look forward to speaking to everyone about. I think it will be really, really transformative. And if it goes well at Fulton Elliott Chelsea, which I know it will really unlock a lot of other potential at some of our other developments.
Thank you. And Michael, can you talk a little bit about the resident engagement through your process in Cambridge? And before you speak, number of people keep asking, what is RAD? So RAD is the rental assistance demonstration, which is the HUD program that allows housing authorities to convert their public housing into the project-based Section 8 program. So when they're talking about conversion, that's what they're talking about.
And I would kind of build on what Lisa said, and also I could go on all day on this question, but you know, residents are nervous about RAD or Section 18 or low-income housing tax credits because there is a change of ownership, right? You're going from the public housing authority. Here, you know, we're putting together LLCs under our nonprofits. We're bringing in investors, and every one of our deals is set. We call it belts and suspenders. We have a lease on. We actually own the land. The housing authority owns the land. And we basically have a long-term ground lease with the LLC. And but you know, trying to explain that to residents in the beginning was very, very difficult, right? They hear, you know, Bank of America is coming in or Citibank is coming in. What are they going to do? And we have a very strong track record. I mean, we've gone through about 2/3 of our portfolio completely gutted and rebuilt, and we have not displaced any resident. We've actually been able to checkerboard people throughout our entire portfolio while we're doing this work. Again, if I have a 300-unit building, I can't displace 300 elders at once. I have to do the building while it's occupied. All that construction is happening around existing residents. It is messy, it is loud, but in the end, right, the residents are so happy because they have a brand new unit. They have a unit that they can be proud of, and they have a unit that they know that they can live in for the long term. So our residents, back when Greg was here, Greg Russ, we actually started, before we even knew about RAD, before President Obama came in, we actually started little dog and pony shows around the city saying to all our residents, public housing can't continue the way it's going. We can't live on appropriations, right? We can't live on prorated appropriations. We have to know what is coming in on a yearly basis. So we knew we had to change, but at the time we didn't know what we had to change to. But we've kept that discussion going as all these programs come in. We've kept that discussion going, and we've kept talking to our residents about how things are changing. And they've actually seen 3 of our properties come back from the 15-year compliance period. So here they are, they're afraid privatization, you know, at the end, the housing authority is going to lose the property. We've had 3 large properties already come back after the compliance period. So again, talking to the residents, having them participate, as Lisa said, through the whole process, and not developing to, but developing with your resident is very important.
Ivory, I'm going to give you the last word. And I spent a lot of time with Home Forward about 5-6 years ago, and I know resident engagement has been a priority there for a long time. So take it away.
Absolutely. You know, one of the things, one of our core values is respect and compassion. And we always say housing is at the core of what we do, and people are the reason it matters. And so how we breathe life into that is that we approach all of our work with a deep understanding that our resident engagement and community engagement are two different things, and we cannot get them confused. They're two different things. We always center the voices of our residents in all of our redevelopment plans, focusing primarily on the most impacted folks, and that is our residents. And so some of the things that we do is we engage our residents through conversations like, what do you like living? What do you like about living here, right? What do you want to improve? Let's talk about the site plans. Let's even talk about amenities in the units, washer, dryer hookups, community spaces, parking, gardenings. How do you want to see the building bringing in more light, right? Being in Pacific Northwest, we value the light coming in because we have these great clouds sometimes that won't quite go away. And so, at the end of the day, we want an environment for all ages of folks who will call this place that they're working with home. And what does that look like? And so having an inclusive environment where residents are leading the conversations, and as Lisa and Michael said, just planning, with residents and not for them.
Thank you all. This has been a just terrific discussion. As you can tell by the number of questions, people are really engaged. And I'm going to turn this over to Will Fisher to close us out with some thoughts about future directions for the public housing program.
Thanks, Sue, and thanks to all of our speakers and everyone for joining us today. So I think for me, I think there's two main takeaways from the discussion today and from the state of public housing more generally. I think one is that there's a lot of great things going on. We heard about what HUD's been doing, and I think that's part of a broader, there's just been a lot of great innovation in federal public housing policy over the last decade or a little more. And also lots of local housing agencies are doing great things, working with residents and communities to improve public housing, often making use of those tools that HUD has provided. But I think all that said, it's also really important to bear in mind that there are still tremendous challenges and lots of things that are going wrong. There are many public housing residents that live in really difficult circumstances, sometimes in unsafe or unhealthy conditions. And that comes back to something that you've heard lots of people say here, that there's just been a long history of federal underfunding of public housing. And we've accumulated a backlog of unmet renovation needs. I think we've heard numbers ranging from like $65 billion to up to $120 billion or more, any of which are just enormous numbers. And so we need most of all to take on that underfunding. And part of that is to stop digging the hole deeper and provide public housing with more adequate ongoing funding, both through public housing capital subsidies and also through operating subsidies as part of annual appropriations. And then also a big part of it is conversion to Section 8, long-term project-based Section 8 subsidies through RAD and other initiatives, since those, as we've heard, are more adequate and more sustainably funded by the federal government typically, and also allow leveraging of other federal and state and local subsidies. So that's all important, but I think it's also really crucial to bear in mind that we're not going to be able to fully meet the need of public housing and its residents without a large infusion of federal public housing capital funding. And, as a couple of people mentioned, the closest we've come to that was in the Build Back Better legislation in 2021, where there was $65 billion in capital funding that was in a bill that actually passed the House of Representatives. And that was very close to passage in the Senate until negotiations broke down for reasons that really weren't particularly related to public housing. And it's hard to know exactly what the right number is, but certainly it may not be the full capital need of maybe $100 billion or more, but we certainly need tens of billions of dollars of federal funding. And I think it can be depressing that we came so close during Build Back Better and it wasn't enacted. But I think it's also really important to bear in mind. So I've been, doing federal housing policy for not as long as Sue or some of the other people on this call, but but for over 20 years. And for most of that time, it would have been considered outlandish that the idea of federal legislation that would provide $65 billion in public housing capital funding, like that would have been something that advocates would have been told not even to talk about. And I think that a tremendous amount of credit should go to residents and to advocates and to public housing agencies and to other friends of public housing that have made the case over many years to Congress and to other policymakers about what the needs in public housing really are, and that the importance of meeting them, and that the fact that it came so close is very much a reflection of those efforts. And I think going forward, it's really important that we make use of all of this like range of tools that we've talked about and be creative and make the most of the resources that are out there. But it's also, I think, critical not to lose sight of what the real need is, that we, just need a lot of money for this program. And that we should all, I don't know, I mean, we're not going to get $65 billion in 2024. I don't know, a lot depends on politics. I don't know what the next window will be, if it'll be 2025 or further down the road. But I think it's really critical for all of us to keep reminding policymakers of what we really need in order to meet our obligations to public housing residents and to preserve this really vital resource into the future. And with that, I will turn it over to Peggy.
Thanks, Will. And so my job here is to wrap things up. So I want to thank all of today's speakers for the excellent information that they provided. And I hope that, building off of what Will just said, that today put a spotlight on the fact that there's a lot of good work that can happen to improve public housing today and not wait. But we can't be content with that. We have to keep pressing federal policymakers to not obstigate their role in providing more resources for public housing. It's what public housing residents deserve, and we can't let folks languish in substandard housing any longer. I want to thank all of you who participated with us today. We'll be sending out resources, as Sue mentioned, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.